Started because it's 11 o'clock and I know y'all's time is precious. For all of those who are on Zoom, hi. We are missing you physically sitting here, but glad you're here. Today we have Ashley Dickey. She is going to present on boundaries, and we all need boundaries. This is a part of our mental health awareness reach out campaign. So we will hopefully have more of these throughout the semester, maybe even the summer and in the fall. So be looking forward to those. This is probably the last one we will do on Zoom from a mental health awareness status because we need physical bodies, and I think that is good for your mental health to be physically, socially in the loop. So I will let Ashley take over and let her walk through her bio, and good job.
Thank you. Basically, the only part of my bio that would be relevant for y'all is that I see a lot of ICC students. I'm a mental health therapist, and again, I see a lot of your students. I'm going to be honest, today's April Fool's Day, so I thought of saying something like boundaries, and then walking off and then coming back. But I didn't know my audience, so I set a boundary with myself and said, no. So what I want to do, I knew that most of you would be doing Zoom, and I don't blame you. However, if you are doing work while watching this presentation, maybe this presentation is exactly for you. So I've got a little questionnaire, and I'm not going to read all of them because it's about 20 questions, but just to kind of give you an idea. So when I ask these, I want you to just kind of think, is this never me? Is this rarely me? Sometimes me? Yeah, this is me most of the time, or this is me always. Do you feel stressed out, overwhelmed, burnout? Would you do most anything to avoid hurting others? Do you feel as if your kids, your parents, your mate, other people run your life? Do you feel as if you are never caught up, or is that if life is not your own? Do you feel taken advantage of by those you love? Do you resent others for being so demanding and inconsiderate? Do others' needs seem to be much more urgent than your own? Do you tend to meet others' needs before your own? Do you hate to disappoint others? You can kind of see where this is going. That's why I'm not going to sit here and read all 20 of them. If you want a copy of this for yourself, I will be more than happy to send you one. But you kind of get an idea. So let's look at, what is a boundary? We hear it all the time. What is it? It's a defined line that defines who we are and how we interact with others. So you've heard like personal space. It's what I can control, basically. I can control me. I can control what I'm responsible for, my feelings, my resources, things like that. I can't control others. Boundaries equal limits that we expect, we need, and the way we want to be treated. So, why do we need them? If I told you our body keeps up with every single thing, all that stress, all the time, you're like, that doesn't bother me, that little thing doesn't bother me, your body's keeping that. And if you don't believe me, just come see me and I will prove to you your body's keeping up with it. So when we're able to do these boundaries, it's good for our health, our happiness, and success in relationships, in our job, in just anywhere. So when we only focus on the others, We become frustrated. We become irritable. We become exhausted. We feel mistreated. Burnout. I can't say enough about burnout. In fact, last year I did a whole presentation on just that. Lack of boundaries equals burnout. So boundaries ensure we know who we are. We know what we need. We know what matters to us. We know what we like, what we don't like, what we believe, who we are basically at our core. What I tell a lot of my clients is, here I am people pleasing. Here I am doing what everybody else wants me to do. Here's my authentic self. Here is who I truly am. Here's what I want, who I am. And the closer we get to that, the more balanced our life. The further we get to that, that's where the stress is going to increase. That's where our mental illness is going to increase. Our anxiety is going to go up, depression, etc. So, again, if we don't have them, we become overcommitted. I'm pretty sure that sounds familiar. We feel like we have to give all the time. We're taken advantage of. We compromise our values. Again, we become resentful, exhausted. We feel guilty. I know that even the title of this is You Can Set Boundaries Even in the South, even in the hospitality state. And it's true. So one of the biggest things about boundaries is it's self-care. A lot of people, think of self-care as getting your nails done and your hair done. And yeah, it can be self-care, but so can boundaries. And I read somewhere that if we don't set boundaries, we can't do any of the other self-care. You have to have those boundaries, the healthy boundaries. So I think now it would be interesting to talk about what a boundary is not. Some of the myths that you think of. Boundaries aren't controlling. They're not meant to control others. They're not demanding. They're not ultimatums. So with an ultimatum, let's talk about that. If I tell somebody, I'm going to do this if you do this, and I'm doing it in a way of controlling that person, that's manipulation. I'm trying to control what they do. I'm trying to control their behavior. But if I sit down and I'm like, if you talk to me this way, I'm going to leave. That's a boundary. It's all about intent, whether that intent is to manipulate or whether it is, hey, I'm not okay with this. That's the difference. So when it says they aren't ultimatums, they're not. But I feel that even people would think the last thing I said was an ultimatum, and it's not. Because I don't care whether you stay in my life or not. I'm telling you, if you do this, I'm leaving. Drugs. If you continue to drink, I'm not going to be here. That's a boundary. That's a boundary, I teach with a lot of people who have addicts in their life. Which brings me to the next point. They're not set in stone. A lot of times people think boundaries mean I have to cut this person out of my life. And that's not what it means. Boundaries can be just little things. We keep boundaries with ourselves. Those are the most important. If I don't feel like going and doing something, I'm not. I don't have to explain it. So they're not set in stone. And actually, it's the opposite. People look at boundaries and they say, again, oh my gosh, it looks like I don't love this person. That's not it. Boundaries, if anybody sets them with you. I've had some, people set them with me, and I'm going to be honest, they hurt. But it doesn't mean that person wants you out of their life. It really means, hey, I love you. I want you in my life. Where there are other people, that's not the case. Especially like if the trust is not there, again, you get to decide what vulnerability looks like too, which is a boundary. Because I read something too, and it was Brene Brown, who said, if you have vulnerability but you don't have a boundary, it's not vulnerability. Think about it. Social media. You hear that person that tells every single thing going on with them. They didn't set a boundary with it. That's not being vulnerable. So it's not nagging, it's not criticizing, and it's being respectful. So I want to go back to like the demanding thing. A big topic lately, and I'm not getting into the politics of it. Will Smith set a boundary with Chris Rock. Was it a healthy boundary? No. So I bring that up to say, like, yes, he set a boundary. We could say that. He said, I'm not okay with this. Again, it's not demanding, though. So that's not necessarily a healthy boundary. So that's why I want to get into what a healthy boundary is. I'll even use myself as an example, too. Apparently, I have this tone. Boundaries are not impulsive. I find myself sometimes when you piss me off, I'm going to set a boundary. And I'm thinking, yeah, I did good. I set a boundary, but it wasn't a healthy boundary. Healthy boundaries are kind of, you think about it. You meditate on it. And, you know, they're clear. They're direct. They're the opposite of what I had just said. They're statements. So if I told you, you need to go do this, that's a demand. I feel. So you want to use I statements. I feel uncomfortable when we talk about this. Stop talking about this. That's a demand. Could it be a boundary? Again, not a healthy one, but so you want to really use I statements. I know it sounds cheesy, but the reason behind that is, and I teach my clients this, if you don't use I statements, when I did that and I pointed to you, you kind of felt a certain way, like you kind of would be on the defense, like, wait a second. And that's any of us. So when we say, I feel, you took it a little bit better. They're kind. As I mentioned earlier, it is self-care. I can't say that enough. It's self-care. We honor our own needs, our own choices. So why are boundaries hard to set? They're unfamiliar. Even in our relationships, we tend to go with people that are familiar to us. It can be on an unconscious level, but that is exactly what we are doing. So if you've never had somebody set healthy boundaries, it's a foreign language. You don't know what that looks like. Which brings me to the next point. Dysfunctional family patterns. When you're looking at the families, you're looking at like arguing all the time, the controlling, manipulation, addiction, those types of things. Those are the families that a lot of us grew up in. I mean, just to be honest. And even with my clients, when I talk about family members, you know, I always love when they come in and they're like, my mom thinks that we only talk about her during the session. And I'm like, well, you know, the session's not about mom. But it does help to look at patterns so that we can look at ourselves and we can work on ourselves. So I tell them, because I either get that, or I get the opposite. My mom's a saint. She's never done anything wrong. They're really, really timid. They don't want to say anything bad. So I put a boundary of, hey, look, when we talk about mom, dad, or anybody that you've got a relationship with, it doesn't mean that they're a bad person. Going back to the Will Smith thing, he's not a bad person. It's a trauma response. When I have that certain tone with people, I wasn't even aware of it until it got brought to my attention. I never did that to be demanding. It was literally, a lot of times, it's when it involves my child, and I go into survival mode of, oh my gosh, who's going to keep my kid? I've got to go do this. Who's going to keep my kid? And I know a lot of parents can relate to that, especially with the whole pandemic and the classes letting out all the time. So, I want to talk about the different types of families that you see. So, you have the rigid boundaries. This is where, and I see a lot of this, there's no wiggle room. It's black and white. You either do it this way, you do it my way, there's no other way. In that, you see the world as black and white. There's no gray. I either have to be this way, I have to be perfect, or I can't do it. That's black and white, because nobody can be perfect. Again, no flexibility. You feel micromanaged. You kind of micromanage yourself. You lack empathy. Those types of families, they keep the secrets. They don't want an outsider to come in because that's a threat. There's a lot of shame. And a big one is not knowing your identity. You don't know who you are. And then you look at like a weak boundary. And I'm going to explain these a little bit more in detail, but are examples. So when you look at a weak boundary, it's the opposite. See it a lot too. You don't know what safety looks like. If we didn't teach our kid, hey, it might be best not to touch that stove, then our kid is going to touch the stove. They don't know that it's hot. Kids feel unsafe, or in those families, you don't feel safe. There's lack of boundaries. The world's very unpredictable. It's scary. Again, having trouble trusting others. The biggest one I see is I'm responsible for everyone else. I see that a lot. I'm responsible for everyone else. Because that's what they grew up in. That's when you don't have the boundaries. I don't have any personal rights. I sacrifice to make others happy. So when we look at rigid boundaries, again, if you're a parent, or I recommend anybody to see this movie. I actually have told my clients, hey, I need you to watch this movie so we can talk about it. But Encanto, or I say Encanto, but I've been told it's Encanto. So Encanto, if you look at Abuela, very rigid boundaries. There's no wiggle room. You do it my way, that's it. And if you look behind that, it's safety. Abuela is doing that. She wants to protect her family. She had a traumatic event happen, and she thinks, hey, if we veer off this path, then something bad's going to happen. We're going to lose our magic. So that's an example of a rigid boundary. There's lots of them that I could say for weak boundary, but the one that keeps popping up in my mind, forgive me, is Mean Girls. The mom, when she says, I'm the cool mom. What's the 411, you guys? That right there is weak boundaries. Also, another thing that pops up into my mind is the Spider-Man movie. Doctor Strange. Very rigid boundaries. No, we've got to do it this way. Peter Parker, no boundaries. Just hey, I'm going to save the world. And it wasn't until later on in the movie that he set more of the healthy boundaries. You could say the same thing with Iron Man and Captain America. Captain America is your people pleaser. He wants to do everything. So those are just some of the examples. And maybe y'all can help me with this one, but a lot of my young adults have asked me, have you seen Euphoria? So I started watching it. I don't even know what kind of boundaries those are. I can tell you they're not healthy, but I think it's a combination, and you can get a combination of rigid and weak. So just looking at those and looking at your own family, that's going to kind of tell you where you lie in boundaries and why you lie in the way you do. So what are barriers to us setting boundaries? Nobody modeled them for us. I just talked about that. They're unfamiliar. If nobody showed you something, how do you know what that looks like? A lot of my clients, they come from like dysfunctional relationships and they beat themselves up over that. And I'm like, well, how can you expect yourself to be in a healthy relationship when you don't know what that looks like? So same with boundaries. If you don't know, you don't know. Fear. I'm afraid that this person's going to leave. I'm afraid that they're not going to be my friend. I've had some, they fear for safety, and that's a whole different ballgame. You definitely want to set a boundary around your safety. But if it's like, I'm afraid of this person calling me this, or I'm afraid of my mom calling me that, I'm like, so let them. You're not responsible for their reaction to the boundary you set. So that's a lot of the time. Or you set a boundary, it doesn't work. You're like, I'm done with this. Boundaries, no. And then the biggest one of the biggest things I do in therapy is help a person figure out who they are. And that's, again, we talked about that. That's a lot with boundaries. Boundaries help us figure out who we are at our core. So, when we set these boundaries, what does that look like? These are the questions you need to ask yourself. What boundary-related problem am I facing right now? When I say that, I'll give an example. Okay, we had really bad weather. I'm from Batesville, and we actually did have a tornado touchdown. But before that, I switched my clients to telehealth. I had a new client, and I felt guilty. I was like, no, I can make it up there. I can do that. It's during the time of the worst storm, but I can make it in person. I don't want this person to not come see me. But then I meditated on it, and I'm like, no, it's for safety. Because in Oxford, I don't know about here, but a lot of the buildings, yeah. So I don't know where we would go. I kind of analyzed that. Going back to boundaries are not selfish, I thought of the other person too. And I decided, hey, look, I'm going to switch everybody to telehealth. And I actually got to meet them the next day, and we laughed about it. They agreed with me. They're like, yes, thank you for that. So you don't know how that other person's going to react, but that's not your responsibility. So ask yourself, you can get this feeling, kind of like an anxious feeling or just an uneasy feeling. You may want to set a boundary. What outcome do I want to accomplish? What am I hoping to accomplish when I set this boundary? And your feelings. Again, if I'm feeling my heart kind of racing, maybe maybe that's not the best thing for me. One of the boundaries, I really struggle with this one, but spending. That's a boundary you can set with yourself. Like, hey, maybe I don't need to be spending this money right now. My Amazon cart says different, but maybe it's not the best right now. That's a boundary. I'm pretty sure y'all want to know some work boundaries. Hey, I can't work past 5. It's clear, it's direct. I know y'all are looking at me like, yeah, I'll tell you, I was a social worker for about a decade before I became a therapist. And during that time, I had no boundaries. I worked for a place where literally I watched a mom and a daughter fight right in front of me, and I couldn't do anything because they were in a program where you were the help. I didn't set those boundaries. Burnout. Burnout, 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 burnout. And when I was going through my program, it's really funny because I didn't know what kind of counseling I wanted to do, but I knew I didn't want to work with addiction. But when I actually was going and getting ready to do my internship, I decided it would be best for me to work with addiction. Because what that taught me is, honestly, I can give you these tools, but if you go use, that's not on me. It's a really hard thing, especially when you are working with this client and they are telling you, and they really mean it at that moment of, I'm not going to use. And then they get triggered and they're gone. They've got an Uber and they're gone. I mean, those are things that when I was a social worker, I would take to heart. But setting boundaries, knowing that, hey, look, I'm not responsible for that person getting in that vehicle. And again, I work with parents of addicts sometimes, and cutting them off. That's one of the best things you can do. The tough love, it really is hard, but it's the best thing for that addict. So when you're looking at boundaries too, as I said before, they can be whatever you want them to be. I tell my clients, I'm like, hey, look, maybe we need to set a boundary here. And they're like, well, I don't want that person out of my life. And I'm like, they don't have to be. You can tell them, hey, I'm not going to stay if it's this, 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 or this. Or I don't want to listen to this. Anything like that. They get to determine what that looks like. Not me, not anybody else. And the same for you. You get to determine what the boundary looks like for yourself. Again, back to work. If you don't set those boundaries, you will end up being burnout. And long-term burnout, long-term stress, you get to that point that you have chronic stress. Again, I told you your body keeps up with everything. So when you have chronic stress, your body is automatically producing that cortisol, that stress hormone. And what helps with that is doing the breathing techniques. And again, setting boundaries. So what are some questions y'all have about boundaries? I know I'm looking at y'all, but
I'm checking the chat.
Anybody on the Zoom, y'all can, isn't there a chat thing on the Zoom?
Yeah, I have
You
it.
can type it in? Okay. If y'all have questions on the Zoom, just type it in and she'll let us know. One thing, I don't know if it's a question, but I've noticed like sometimes when people say a boundary, it almost has a negative connotation with it, like, I'm setting a boundary. Well, that's not necessarily true. It's just, I know with my social media ambassadors, I always tell them first thing, don't text me after 9 o'clock.
Yeah.
Now, they do, but then they also know I'm not going to answer them until the next morning.
You're modeling
So,
that.
Right. I mean, it's not necessarily negative. It's just, this is what I'm going to do. So I think that's good to hear that boundaries aren't always negative, especially with our children and our family and things like that.
Yes.
So,
We had one person who asked, what type of reaction did you say Will's was? So was it Will Smith?
I had one.
I don't want to get into the politics of it, but I will educate on this. Whether you believe it's right or wrong, it's a trauma response. We all have trauma responses, and I know social media is doing a really great job of talking about boundaries and all this kind of stuff. But really it was, because if you look at his past, from my knowledge, I don't know the situation, so I will say that. Apparently his dad abused his mom. And if you grew up in that kind of environment, any little thing can trigger you to the point you are no longer in control, and before you know it, you're doing something you will regret. I'll give you an example. Okay, I want you to think about a time when you were angry. Like really angry. I'm sure you did something that you regret. I know I have. When we get angry, I would even say anxious, we lose IQ points. Fun fact. So that's why when you look at it and you lose those IQ points and you come back to regulating your emotions, you're like, I'm sorry, I didn't mean that. That's why. So just looking at that, and while I'm on that subject, my child is autistic, and we are in Autism Awareness Month. So from my understanding, Chris Rock. He doesn't have autism. He has nonverbal learning disorder. It's not in the DSM. It may be in the new DSM that's coming out. I'm really hoping that they are giving a lot more to autism. But either way, one of the things is not picking up on social cues. I've literally asked a client, hey, look, do you know social cues? And they're like, oh, yeah. And I kind of was hinting toward leaving, and I stood up, never got it. So in that case, if you don't pick up on social cues and somebody's coming up to you, you don't know. It's a socially awkward type situation. So sad situation all the way around. The only thing I will do in that situation is just educate people. The other one I heard, again, whether you like these people or not, with Jada. I don't know if she's toxic. Again, not getting into all that. But I will say people have said she should have stopped him. Okay, how? You're not responsible for somebody else's action. You can't be. You can't. So yeah, it's easy for us to sit there and say that kind of stuff, but in reality we can't. We cannot control another person doing what they're doing. And that's kind of those boundaries. Any other ones?
I have a question. So like for, you've got a student coming to college for the first time, what would just be some maybe preliminary boundaries you would recommend they set before they even start?
Okay. Explain a little bit more.
I guess what advice would you have to new students on like, hey, welcome to college, think about setting these boundaries? I don't know if you have any like,
Okay.
if you work with students who like, hey, had you set these boundaries when you first got here, you wouldn't be.
Each student's going to be different because of the family. And again, not saying anything bad about families, but literally it's our worldview. So you can tell them like what a boundary is, and then they can like, just pretty much what I was reading. You can do that with them, or you can recommend, another boundary I had is I hate PowerPoints. I'm not that person. If you were looking for that, I'm sorry. It's not me. So lots of stress. I said no. But this is one of the books that she's really great. Her name is Sharon Martin. I want to make sure I said it right. But this is the Better Boundaries workbook. So if you look, you actually can fill out information. So it might be something you could recommend. There's also another book. I don't know the author, but it's called Boundaries.
But I forgot his name too.
I don't know his name, but I noticed like he has one for kids. I think there's one for
I need all of it.
you and me both.
She has one more question on this.
Okay.
So we have a new question. Someone asked, what if a boundary is set with someone, the person is unavoidable, who does not acknowledge the boundary and the relationship must still be maintained?
Not my circus, not my monkeys. My favorite saying, because it's a boundary. I really want to put that somewhere in my office. I really, really do. But hadn't done it yet. Okay. I'll use myself as an example. One of the first boundaries I set was with my mom. And it wasn't anything like bad, but she wanted to have Christmas time. Holidays, you find yourself really having to set boundaries. But she wanted to do a certain time. And I couldn't make that certain time because my husband's family, they were meeting, and his grandmother, we didn't know how much longer she had to live. So I thought about it, and I told my mom, hey, look, if we cannot figure out a time, then I'm not coming. And that was really hard, and yes, she got mad, but when she thought about it again, when we regulate our emotions, when we calm down, she changed it. So it can look like that. I know it's tough, especially when you do have to maintain those relationships. That's why I said you get to set that boundary. It's not so black and white.
I think there's more questions yet.
Okay. One other.
On Zoom, have any more questions, or anybody else in here?
I want to, I saw this not too long ago and it really stuck with me. So it said that these roles we take on, say we take on a role of a helper, Enneagram 2. If you know anything about the Enneagram, I'm a helper. So we take on these roles, and if it's a helper, we do everything we can to help people. If we don't help a person, we feel we're doing something wrong. And what it said is it's not the role we take on that's the problem, it's the lack of boundaries. I was like, whew, yeah, that's true. That's very true. So just think about that.
So we do have one comment. Someone said, I find just saying no without following up any reasons help. Reasons open you up to debating your no.
Reasons are trauma responses. 2. No is a complete sentence. You can say no. You're right. Usually when somebody is over-explaining it, it's a trauma response. Meaning they've had to explain every single thing they've done, and so they continue. The way we see ourselves is the way we view relationships. I will go to saying this. I do EMDR, and I'm going to go ahead and tell y'all right now, We all have core messages. And they're negative core messages. Yes, we have positive ones, but they're negative core messages. I'm not good enough. I'm powerless. I'm unsafe. I'm responsible for everyone else. It has to be a I'm message. And I'll give an example of somebody I know. Trauma is unprocessed memories, okay? So what might be traumatic for you may not be traumatic for me. And so with this example, this is a friend of mine who's actually a therapist. When they were in kindergarten, they colored outside of the lines. Again, may not be a traumatic event for you, but for her it was. And that's what we call the touchstone when we do EMDR. That is where that first thought of, I'm not good enough, I have to be perfect, comes in. And then if you look, even now, if you don't work on it, you're getting triggered by it now. So when you're having those trauma responses, it probably goes back to a negative core message. So go to therapy. Go to therapy. A big thing is people think it's just mental illness. No. A good therapist has their own therapist. Because if I'm going to work with people, I need to work on my own stuff before I go and help them to figure out their life. So, go to therapy. You need help find a therapist? I'll do my best. Sadly, it's a lot of shortage, but.
Well, thank you so much.
No
Thank you all
problem.
for being here. I do appreciate it very much.
No problem.
And thank y'all for being on Zoom. If y'all have any more questions, please email me. If you have any suggestions of mental health professional developments that you would like to hear, please email me and let me know. I'm so excited to get this, to keep this going, and to continue this educational process and these conversations. So thank y'all for being here today, and happy Friday.